long are you going to wear that pathetic rag in my house?" My older brother Garrett sneered. He dropped his shoulder, driving his weight into my side with a hard, calculated shove, sending a shock of freezing ice water from his glass soaking straight through the threadbare wool of my coat. "Real doctors save lives and make millions, but you cut up dead bodies on a government paycheck. You're bad luck." The biting Idaho wind whipped across the hillside, but it was a dull ache compared to the icy dampness seeping through my clothes. Thick, acrid smoke from the pine wood smoker choked the backyard air, mingling with the stale scent of Garrett's pale ale. He shoved the dripping neck of his beer bottle inches from my face, tapping the cold brown glass against my collarbone. He thrived on this. He needed the audience of our Boise neighbors to validate his self-proclaimed status as the rugged, successful patriarch of the Lee family. His existence ran on a fragile ego and a relentless greed for easy money. He paraded around the ranch as the ultimate provider, soaking up the local admiration, while my hazard pay quietly wired from military accounts kept the bank from seizing the very dirt he stood on. I carried the financial weight in silence, and in return, he branded me a morbid disappointment, a woman wasting her life in a morgue. Marlene, his wife, stepped up to flank him. She flicked a crumpled, grease-stained paper napkin directly at my chest. It bounced off my lapel and hit the grass. "Wipe yourself off and go clear the patio tables, Victoria." Marlene ordered, her eyes tracing over my faded boots with open disgust. "Don't ruin the mood for the guests." I didn't bend down to pick up the trash. I stood perfectly still, letting the freezing water run down my ribs. My jaw locked. Underneath the wet fabric of my shirt, the cold silver edge of my late father's luminous military stopwatch, the exact one he carried during his Air Force tours, pressed hard against my ribs. It was a grounding weight, a physical reminder of the oath I took. They turned their backs, walking away to clink glasses with the local contractors, laughing at the quiet, outcast sister. They felt untouchable. They had no idea the silent woman they just sent to bust their dirty plates held the exact legal authority to strip away their freedom. Garrett was busy raising a toast to a miraculous $400,000 insurance payout, fully convinced his fraudulent scheme was safely buried under 6 feet of dirt. He remained blissfully ignorant of whose stainless steel table that specific secret had crossed just 3 weeks ago. Before I show you how a single drop of ink dismantled this fake Idaho empire, hit the like button and subscribe to Violet's Slow Vengeance. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. 2,000 miles away from the choking pine smoke and the arrogant laughter of that Idaho hillside, the air possessed a stark, unforgiving purity. Inside the Doverport mortuary, there was no wind. There was no chaotic chatter. The only sound existing in the cavernous examination room was the low, steady mechanical hum of the industrial high-efficiency particulate air filters working tirelessly to scrub the atmosphere clean. The temperature was perpetually locked at a biting 60 degrees. The relentless chill seeped right through the thick rubber soles of my tactical boots, traveling up my shins and settling deep into my joints. It was a physical necessity to preserve the fragile evidence of human sacrifice, but the cold always felt like a heavy, quiet companion standing right beside me. I stood over the center of the room, my body encased in a stiff, crinkling white protective suit. A thick plastic face shield pressed tight against my forehead, leaving a dull, stinging red indentation across my skin. My hands were wrapped in a double layer of blue nitrile surgical gloves. The heavy overhead halogen lights beamed down, casting a blinding, shadowless glare across the grooved surface of the stainless steel autopsy table. The sharp, clinical bite of isopropyl alcohol heavy bleach. And formaldehyde burned the inside of my nostrils. It was an aggressive, sterile scent designed to mask the underlying truth of the room. The truth smelled like scorched Kevlar, pulverized desert dirt, and the heavy metallic tang of dried copper. Before me rested the shattered remnants of a United States soldier. The uniform was torn, stiffened with dark mud, and the violent residue of an overseas deployment. My gloved fingers moved with slow, deliberate precision. I did not rush. You never rush in this room. I carefully separated a frayed piece of olive drab fabric away from a fractured collarbone. The silence in the facility was sacred, broken only by the sharp, metallic clink of my stainless steel forceps dropping into a surgical kidney basin. We were the last line of defense for the fallen, the final hands to touch them before they returned to the earth. My eyes drifted to the very edge of the freezing metal table. Resting right on the polished rim, stark against the clinical environment, was a heavy, scratched brass stopwatch. The thick glass face was spiderwebbed with a tiny crack near the top edge, and the phosphorus dials glowed a faint ghostly green under the harsh halogens. It was not standard medical equipment. It was a relic. It belonged to Chief Master Sergeant Walter Lee, my father. I carried it across 3 different duty stations, across oceans and straight into the heart of Dover Air Force Base. I reached out, pressing my thick blue gloves against the cold brass casing. The metal felt dense and grounded. I could almost see my father's rough grease-stained thumb pressing down on the top button timing training drills on a foggy morning tarmac. His voice echoed in the sterile quiet of the morgue, a low, gravelly baritone vibrating against the inside of my skull. The dead can't speak, Victoria. He had told me, his calloused hands resting heavy on my teenage shoulders. So someone has to refuse to look away. That single ironclad directive had forged the entire trajectory of my existence. It was the reason I traded the sunlit valleys of the Snake River for windowless subterranean laboratories. It was the reason I spent 12 hours a day staring directly into the devastating aftermath of combat, reassembling shattered fragments of bone and tissue, searching for the hidden trajectories of shrapnel. I documented the exact mechanisms of their sacrifice so their families would have the truth. It was a grueling, haunting burden, but it was an honorable one. I refused to look away. Yet the moment I stepped out of the sterile zone, the profound dignity of my work was violently hijacked by the parasitic reality of my own bloodline. The heavy steel door of the locker room clicked shut behind me, sealing off the freezing examination floor. The air in here was warmer, carrying the faint scent of antibacterial soap and stale break room coffee. I stripped off the crinkling white suit, tossing it into the biohazard bin. My shoulders ached, a dull grinding tension radiating down my spine from hours of leaning over the steel table. I walked to the deep stainless steel sink and pushed the heavy lever. Scalding hot water rushed out. I scrubbed my hands with a stiff bristled brush, digging the harsh soap under my fingernails until the skin turned a raw, angry red. I scrubbed until the phantom smell of the mortuary faded, but the fatigue remained baked right into my bones. I walked over to my narrow metal locker and dialed the combination. The gray door swung open. Resting on the top shelf, my civilian cell phone illuminated the dark metal interior. The screen vibrated with a harsh, relentless buzzing, sliding a fraction of an inch across the shelf. I reached up and grabbed the device. The bright screen glared against my tired eyes. 3 new text messages, all from Garrett. The first message read, "Bank sent another notice. They are threatening to lock the gates on the lower pasture next week." The second message arrived a minute later. "I am handling the big picture investments, but cash flow is tied up. You need to pull your weight for the family." My jaw tightened. I unlocked the screen, the blue light reflecting in the dark circles under my eyes. I did not type a response. I did not waste my breath arguing with a man who viewed my military career as a convenient, bottomless slush fund. I opened a highly secure encrypted banking application. The interface loaded, displaying the meager balance of my personal checking account. I navigated to the routing section. I typed in the account number for the Boise agricultural lender, holding the deed to the Lee family ranch. My fingers hovered over the digital keypad. I entered the exact figure required to stop the foreclosure, $6,400. It was the entirety of my monthly officer base pay combined with the hazard duty stipend I earned handling toxic biological agents. I pressed the green confirmation button. The screen flashed, processing the transaction. The funds vanished from my account, flying across the digital ether to rescue a piece of land my brother was mismanaging into the ground. I leaned my back against the cold metal lockers and slid down until I hit the hard linoleum floor. I pulled my knees up, resting my forearms across them. I lived in a sparse cinder block apartment on the base, sleeping on a rigid mattress, eating tasteless, chalky protein bars for dinner, just to keep the utility bills low. I stripped my own life down to the absolute bare minimum so the Lee family ranch could survive. But out in the rugged, sun-drenched hills of Idaho, Garrett painted an entirely different portrait for the locals. I opened a social media application on my phone. Right at the top of the feed was a new photograph uploaded by my brother. He stood on a sprawling, freshly stained cedar deck overlooking the Hells Canyon Ridge. He wore a crisp, expensive flannel shirt and held a custom-engraved hunting rifle in one hand, a local craft beer in the other. His smile was broad, arrogant, and perfectly practiced for the camera. The caption below the photo read, "Hard work and smart business keep this ranch running. A true self-reliant Idaho man protects his family legacy." My stomach churned. A bitter, acidic taste rose in the back of my throat. He claimed the frontier grit. He wore the costume of a rugged individualist, soaking up the admiration of the conservative, tight-knit Boise community. The neighbors looked at Garrett and saw a fierce, independent provider holding the line. They did not see the quiet, exhausted military medical examiner financing his entire charade from a windowless morgue 2,000 miles away. Marlene frequently chimed into his comment sections, feeding the delusion. She praised his tireless dedication to the family. And whenever my name surfaced during their lavish backyard rodeos or community barbecues, they delivered the final insulting blow to my dignity. They dismissed my absence with a synchronized, condescending shake of their heads. I scrolled down the screen, finding a comment from a distant cousin asking when I might visit. Garrett had replied, "Victoria's off playing in the mud somewhere. She never had the stomach for real business. Always lingering around hospitals and corpses. It is unnatural. She is just a morbid girl wasting her potential." A morbid girl. I locked the phone screen, plunging the locker room back into the dim, buzzing quiet. The sheer magnitude of his disrespect sat heavy on my chest, a suffocating weight I carried silently. He reduced the sacred, agonizing duty of identifying fallen American heroes to a creepy, unnatural hobby. He took my blood money, saved his fragile ego, and then spat on the very hands that fed him. I closed my eyes, letting the cold linoleum seep into my skin. I did not fight back. I swallowed the poison day after day, choosing to protect my father's memory over my own pride, patiently enduring the exile while my brother danced on a stage funded entirely by my quiet sacrifice. The sun dipped below the jagged spine of the Rocky Mountains, casting long bruised shadows across the Boise hillside. The heavy, biting scent of pine smoke began to fade, replaced by the rich, fatty aroma of charred Snake River salmon and the sharp, sticky sweetness of huckleberry glaze. The evening air grew crisp. The entire extended family gathered around the sprawling oak dining table on the back patio. The thick wood groaned under the weight of expensive catered platters, silver serving trays, and imported wine bottles. I sat at the absolute farthest corner of the table, wedged near the edge of the decking where the amber patio lights barely reached. I was a shadow, a necessary obligation they preferred to keep out of focus. Marlene moved down the length of the table, playing the role of the gracious, wealthy hostess. She held a stack of heavy, pristine porcelain plates. She handed them out to the local contractors, the cousins, and the neighboring ranch owners. The fine china clinked softly against the polished wood, a delicate sound of suburban privilege. She reached my end of the table. The smile vanished from her lips. She did not hand me porcelain. She reached into a plastic bag resting on a side cart and pulled out a thin, flimsy paper plate. She dropped it in front of me. It landed on the oak with a dull, hollow scrape. The cheap white paper buckled almost immediately under a small portion of grilled fish. Marlene did not look me in the eye. She turned her back, adjusting her expensive turquoise necklace, treating me with the casual dismissal usually reserved for a stray dog waiting for scraps on the porch. At the head of the table, Garrett stood up. He picked up a silver spoon and tapped it against the rim of his crystal wine glass. Clink, clink, clink. The sharp metallic noise sliced right through the low hum of conversation. The entire table fell silent. Dozens of faces turned toward the patriarch. Garrett puffed out his chest, shooting his cuffs so the gold links caught the ambient light. He looked down the length of the table, his gaze sweeping over the admiring eyes of our relatives. Family. Garrett projected his voice, coding the word in unearned pride. We have weathered some brutal seasons on this land. The economy tried to break us. The bank tried to fence us out, but a real Idaho man finds a way to protect his own. He raised his glass higher, the dark red liquid swirling against the crystal. I am proud to announce that I just closed a private investment project, $400,000. A collective gasp rippled through the seated guests. My uncle let out a loud booming cheer. Aunt Brenda clapped her hands together, her heavy bracelets rattling. The applause erupted, washing over the patio in a wave of blind adoration. They looked at Garrett like he had single-handedly conquered the frontier. They saw a brilliant, self-reliant businessman who pulled his family back from the brink of ruin through sheer grit. As the clapping died down, my uncle leaned across the table. He gave Garrett a firm, solemn nod of respect. Then his eyes shifted down the wood landing on the dark corner where I sat. His expression changed instantly. The admiration vanished, replaced by tired, heavy pity. He shook his head a slow, deliberate motion before turning back to his wine. The message was unmistakable. Garrett was the savior. I was the ghost. The unmarried broke sister playing with corpses while her brother carried the real weight of the world on his shoulders. I stared down at the flimsy paper plate. The hot salmon grease was already seeping through the cheap material, creating a dark, translucent stain on the wood underneath. I knew exactly what that $400,000 project was. It was not a brilliant real estate maneuver. It was not a savvy stock trade. It was the service members' group life insurance payout. It was federal blood money. It was the exact maximum dollar amount assigned by the United States government to the life of a fallen military member. Garrett and his private medical contacts had fabricated a narrative, forging an accidental death claim to hijack a dead soldier's final benefit. He was standing at the head of our father's table, drinking expensive wine bought with the stolen dignity of an American in uniform, and he was being worshipped for it. My hands rested on my lap beneath the heavy oak table. My fingers curled inward. The calluses on my palms, built from years of gripping stainless steel autopsy saws and heavy bone shears, pressed hard against my own skin. My knuckles turned bone white. My heart beat a slow, agonizing rhythm against my ribs. Every instinct drilled into me as an Air Force officer screamed to stand up, kick the chair back, and expose the rot eating through the center of this family. I said nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the paper plate. I kept my jaw locked shut. I let the relatives pat him on the back. I let Marlene beam with fake humility. I sat in the shadows and absorbed the full suffocating weight of my own isolation. They had stripped away my voice, my place in this family, and the honor of the uniform I wore in secret. Garrett had taken the very foundation of our father's legacy, the unwavering belief that the dead deserved the truth, and traded it for a fraudulent bank deposit. He won the night. He claimed the throne. I sat alone in the dark, watching my own bloodline celebrate a crime. The sweet taste of the huckleberry glaze turned to dry ash in my mouth. They had taken everything from me in that moment, my credibility, my family's standing, and the sacred trust my father built on this land. They left me with nothing but a greasy paper plate and the deafening sound of their applause. The applause from the patio faded into a dull, irritating hum as I walked away from the amber glow of the string lights. I left the greasy paper plate resting on the edge of a cold stone planter. The path winding down toward the family stables was unpaved, consisting only of packed Idaho dirt and loose gravel that crunched rhythmically beneath the thick rubber soles of my boots. The atmosphere out here shifted drastically. The cloying, Sweet scent of huckleberry glaze and charred salmon gave way to the sharp, unforgiving aroma of dry, alfalfa-oiled leather saddles and the biting mountain draft sweeping down from the distant Hell's Canyon ridge. I needed the quiet. I needed the temperature to drop and freeze the mounting pressure building at the base of my skull. I stepped into the deep shadow of the main barn. The rough-weathered cedar planks of the empty stalls absorbed the moonlight, creating a corridor of absolute blackness. I closed my eyes, executing a slow, 4-count tactical breath. Inhale, hold, exhale. Before I could draw the second breath, the heavy, uncoordinated scrape of footsteps shattered the silence. The gait was sloppy, lacking any rhythm or discipline. Garrett. He carried the stench of the celebration with him like a toxic cloud. Expensive bourbon, roasted meat, and the sour tang of arrogant sweat cut through the clean scent of the hay. He stepped into the dimly lit corridor of the barn, holding a fresh crystal tumbler of amber liquid. His face was flushed, a dark, blotchy red, emboldened by the blind adulation of the neighbors. He did not simply walk. He swaggered, an unearned, bloated confidence radiating from his every movement. Running away to hide in the dark, Victoria. Garrett slurred slightly, stopping a few feet away. He took another step, deliberately invading my personal space. He moved into my blind spot, stepping close enough to trap me against the heavy wooden wall of a vacant horse stall. He planted his left hand flat against the timber, inches from my shoulder, leaning his weight forward to physically block my exit path. It was a cheap intimidation tactic, a primitive display of physical dominance meant to make me shrink. I kept my spine perfectly straight. I did not flinch. I let the rough cedar press into the back of my worn jacket. I locked my eyes straight ahead, staring at his expensive collar rather than giving him the satisfaction of eye contact. He tilted his head, letting out a low, patronizing sigh, a classic theatrical display of sarcastic superiority. "You always were so incredibly sensitive," he mocked, looking down his nose at my faded coat and standard-issue boots. "Look at you, almost 40, unmarried, scraping by on a pathetic government paycheck. You spent your best years living a poverty-stricken military life surrounded by tragedy, while the real adults stayed right here and built actual empires." He swirled the bourbon in his glass. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal, an annoying, high-pitched scratching sound in the quiet barn. "Did you see their faces out there on the deck?" he asked, pointing his glass toward the distant patio lights. "They look at me and they see a provider, a man who generates wealth. 400 grand Victoria in 1 week. You couldn't make that in a decade of cutting open stinking corpses." He was actively hunting for a reaction. He wanted me to argue. He wanted me to look small, defensive, and desperate. When I gave him nothing but a flat, emotionless stare, his fragile ego pushed him to brag further. He simply could not resist showing off the mechanism of his supposed genius to the sibling he deemed a failure. "You want to know the secret to real success in this world?" He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial, mocking whisper. "It is realizing the system is run by absolute idiots. The government, the military, the insurance companies, they just push paper around. You find a grieving widow, a cooperative private doctor with a flexible moral compass, and a soldier who took a convenient fatal accident outside of a combat zone." He let out a dry, contemptuous snort. A few adjusted dates on a death certificate, a little creative storytelling on a service member's group life insurance claim, and the Treasury just hands over the maximum payout without blinking. It is child's play for a man who knows how to operate. He was confessing to federal fraud right to my face. He felt entirely invincible, assuming the quiet sister who worked in a morgue lacked the intellect, the clearance, or the authority to comprehend the scale of his crime. He treated a military death, the ultimate sacrifice of a citizen, as a clever little loophole for his bank account. I did not break my posture. My pulse remained steady, a slow, methodical drumbeat echoing the discipline forged in subterranean bunkers. I slowly raised my chin. I looked directly into his bloodshot, cloudy pupils. "You are playing a very dangerous game with federal law, Garrett," I stated. My voice was a flat, sterile void entirely devoid of inflection. No military death is ever overlooked. Every single detail is scrutinized. The warning hung in the freezing mountain air. For a fraction of a second, the muscles in his jaw tightened. A flicker of primitive doubt crossed his eyes, but his narcissism quickly overrode his survival instinct. He threw his head back and let out a deep guttural chuckle. It was a hollow grating sound that bounced off the wooden rafters and died in the hay. He stepped back, lowering his arm from the cedar wall. He reached out and slapped his heavy, sweaty hand down on my left shoulder. It was a hard, patronizing physical strike, meant to demean the kind of pat a master gives a slow, obedient dog. He leaned his face in one last time, the smell of bourbon suffocating the space between us. The insurance is ours. Nobody can prove a thing. That body's buried. Case closed. He pulled his hand back, leaving a damp print on the shoulder of my jacket. He turned on his heel, his expensive leather boots slipping slightly on the dirt floor, and swaggered back toward the glow of the patio lights, eager to rejoin his audience of sycophants. I did not call after him. I did not scream. I did not waste my breath arguing with a dead man walking. I smoothly shifted my stance, bringing my feet together and clasping my hands firmly behind my lower back. I stood at parade rest in the empty barn. The silence rushed back and broken only by the distant whinny of a restless horse and the whistling of the Idaho wind through the timber cracks. I turned my body, pointing my boots toward the long gravel driveway leading out to the main road. I lifted my right foot, bringing the heavy rubber heel down against the packed dirt with a crisp, authoritative snap. I began to walk. My pace was measured precise, the relentless stride of an officer leaving a secured perimeter. I slid my right hand into the deep pocket of my coat. My calloused fingertips brushed past the thick wool lining, landing on the smooth, curved glass of an antique magnifying glass. The cold brass rim felt heavy and solid against my skin. My father's instrument of truth. Garrett believed the dirt had permanently covered his tracks. He had no idea that the soil he just danced on was about to cave in. The drive down the foothills of the Boise Mountains offered nothing but suffocating darkness. I navigated the cheap rental sedan along the winding asphalt, the heater blowing dry, dusty air that irritated my eyes. The arrogant, alcohol-laced laughter from the barn was miles behind me, yet the profound ignorance of my brother still echoed in the quiet cab. He actually believed he had outsmarted the federal government. He thought he had outsmarted me. I pulled into the parking lot of a faded motel right on the edge of the city limits. The flickering neon vacancy sign buzzed overhead, casting erratic red shadows across the cracked concrete. I unlocked the door to room 214 and stepped inside. The atmosphere hit my senses immediately. The enclosed space carried the heavy, unmistakable odor of damp industrial carpet cleaner desperately trying to mask years of stale cigarette smoke. A rusted wall-mounted air conditioning unit hummed a low, unsteady drone. It was a bleak, isolated box. It was exactly what I needed. I bypassed the sagging mattress and walked straight to the cheap laminate desk pushed against the far wall. I dropped my canvas tactical bag onto the surface. The heavy brass zipper parted with a sharp, continuous rip. I reached deep into the padded bottom compartment, my fingers wrapping around the reinforced rubberized casing of a government-issue Panasonic Toughbook. I set the machine on the desk and unlatched the locking mechanism. The hinges offered a stiff mechanical resistance as I opened the screen. I hit the power button. The cooling fan whirred to life, a steady, disciplined sound. Seconds later, the monitor illuminated, casting a stark, pale blue glare across the dark room. The light washed over my face, stripping away the exhausted daughter who had stood silently at the family barbecue, leaving only the clinical, unyielding focus of a military medical examiner. I connected the encrypted satellite uplink. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, typing the 16-character alphanumeric clearance code. The digital barricades dropped. I accessed the secure servers of the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System. The interface was sterile, consisting of rigid gray columns and stark black text. I moved the cursor to the search directory, cross-referencing the specific dates, the regional insurance flags, and the payout parameters Garrett had so proudly boasted about in the barn. The database pulled a match. A single file populated the screen. I clicked the casualty barcode. The monitor refreshed, pulling up the fraudulent civilian death certificate Garrett's hired physician had submitted to the insurance board. Cause of death listed accidental off-duty motor vehicle collision. A simple tragic narrative designed for a quick, unquestioned payout. I split the screen opening the corresponding internal military dossier. The true classified post-mortem report appeared side by side with the forgery. I scrolled down to the primary autopsy photographs. The high-definition images displayed a shattered human form resting on a familiar grooved stainless steel table. I studied the deep lacerations, the distinct skeletal fracture patterns, and the specific angle of the blunt force trauma. The injuries on the monitor did not come from a steering column impact. The lacerations were entirely inconsistent with shattered windshield glass. The physical evidence told a radically different, far more violent story. I knew exactly what caused those specific wounds because 3 weeks ago, I had stood over that exact soldier in a freezing room in Delaware. I had spent 8 hours meticulously documenting every single millimeter of damaged tissue. I had used stainless steel forceps to extract the foreign metallic fragments out of the bone myself. My eyes drifted to the bottom right corner of the authentic military document. Stamped in stark digital ink was my own electronic signature, certifying the true cause of death. Garrett had built his newly found empire on a piece of fabricated civilian paper, assuming the casualty was just a random name lost in the system. He remained fundamentally blind to the fact that the United States military never relinquishes custody of its fallen. The very body he used to fund his ranch expansion had passed directly under my scalpel. I reached back into the canvas bag and pulled out a heavy matte black satellite phone. I bypassed the standard civilian networks, punching in a direct, untraceable sequence. The line encrypted with a short electronic chirp. It rang twice. Criminal Investigation Division, Major Hayes. A sharp alert voice answered. This is Lieutenant Colonel Lee Dover, Port Mortuary. I stated, keeping my tone perfectly level. Go ahead, Colonel. I am transmitting an encrypted data packet regarding an active service members group life insurance claim originating out of the Boise sector. It involves gross medical forgery and wire fraud. Receiving the transmission now, Hayes replied. I heard the rapid clicking of his keyboard over the line. A seasoned investigator, he did not waste time with pleasantries. The civilian documentation contradicts your autopsy findings. The civilian documentation is a fiction designed to trigger a $400,000 payout. I clarified. The primary beneficiary is my brother Garrett Lee. I need immediate tactical overwatch on this file. They are celebrating the deposit tomorrow morning at the local municipal building. Understood, Colonel. I am locking down the bank routing numbers and dispatching a federal team to your coordinates. We have your back. Thank you, Major. I pressed the red button, terminating the connection. The phone went dark. I turned my attention back to the canvas bag. From a waterproof protective sleeve, I extracted a thick brown document envelope. The gold foil eagle seal of the Department of Defense was stamped cleanly in the upper left corner, a quiet symbol of undeniable authority. I routed the authentic, unredacted autopsy findings to the portable printer sitting in my bag. The machine hummed, spitting out the crisp, warm pages of undeniable truth. I gathered the papers, aligning the edges perfectly. I slid the heavy stack into the brown envelope and wrapped the red string tightly around the circular clasp. I set the sealed package on the desk right next to the glowing blue screen. The room was silent again, save for the hum of the air conditioner. The trap was set. The weapon was fully loaded. Tomorrow, the dead would speak. The Boise Municipal Building featured soaring vaulted ceilings and sprawling floors made of polished local mahogany. Morning sunlight poured through the tall arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting long, elegant shadows across the grand hall. Garrett had spared no expense to orchestrate a spectacle. He had rented the central chamber to host the formal signing ceremony for his massive ranch expansion. Dozens of local real estate partners, banking executives, and extended relatives mingled in the open space. Waiters circulated through the crowd with silver trays offering early-hour champagne and fresh espresso. The delicate continuous chiming of crystal glasses provided a soundtrack to his perceived triumph. The air smelled of expensive citrus cologne, roasted coffee beans, and arrogant certainty. Garrett stood at the focal point of the room, positioned behind a massive oak conference table. He wore a newly tailored charcoal suit, adjusting his cuffs while flashing his practiced blinding teeth at the local investors. He held a heavy gold fountain pen hovering over the stack of finalized land deeds. The $400,000 insurance deposit had cleared the regional bank at dawn. He believed the transaction was sealed in stone, rendering him untouchable. Marlene hovered by his side, draped in an expensive cashmere shawl. She was busy bragging to the county commissioner's wife, soaking up the admiration and the envy of the local elite. They were celebrating their stolen fortune, basking in the glow of a crime they thought was buried forever. The heavy brass latches of the municipal hall's double oak doors disengaged with a sharp, echoing crack. The thick wood swung inward, the hinges groaning as the heavy doors scraped against the marble threshold. The sudden, violent intrusion acted like a vacuum, sucking the lively, arrogant chatter right out of the atmosphere. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-sentence. The string quartet playing softly in the corner missed a beat, lowering their bows as the notes faded into an uneasy, suffocating quiet. The sudden drop in atmospheric pressure was palpable, pressing against the eardrums of everyone in the room. I stepped into the grand hall. I did not wear the threadbare wool coat. I did not shrink into the background to collect dirty napkins. I wore the service dress blue uniform of the United States Air Force. The midnight blue fabric held a stiff, unforgiving crease, contrasting sharply with the soft flowing civilian suits filling the room. The polished silver oak leaves pinned to my epaulettes caught the morning sunlight gleaming cold and bright. Above my left breast pocket sat a stacked rack of ribbons, a vibrant, silent testament to years spent operating in the shadows of combat zones and subterranean laboratories. The uniform demanded space. It projected undeniable, terrifying authority. I walked forward. My posture was bone straight, my chin held parallel to the floor. The thick leather soles of my low-quarter dress shoes struck the polished mahogany floorboards. Thud, thud, thud. A relentless, measured cadence that cut through the dead air like a metronome ticking down to an execution. The crowd parted instantly. The wealthy contractors and the gossiping cousins stepped backward, pulling their silk dresses and tailored jackets out of my path. They stared. Their mouths hanging slightly open, their brains struggling to reconcile the quiet mocked sister with the imposing military officer commanding the center aisle. Near the front row of guest chairs sat several older men, local retirees wearing faded veteran caps adorned with infantry and airborne patches. They did not whisper or stare in confusion like the corporate lawyers around them. They read the silver oak leaves on my shoulders. They read the combat deployment medals. As I approached, an elderly man with a wooden cane pushed himself up from his seat. He locked his knees, straightening his stooped back, his face a mask of solemn recognition. The veteran sitting next to him stood up as well. Within seconds, a half-dozen old soldiers were standing at rigid attention, ignoring the wealthy elite in the room, offering unwavering respect to the rank I carried. They understood the price of the uniform. They knew exactly what kind of burden those silver oak leaves required. I stopped exactly 2 feet from the oak signing table. Garrett froze. The confident, booming patriarch vanished in a fraction of a second. His face turned the color of wet cement. The heavy gold fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers, rolling across the expansion deeds and dropping onto the floor with a hollow, rattling clatter. His jaw slackened. The dark, arrogant flush drained from his cheeks so fast his skin took on a sickly, translucent pallor. A single bead of cold sweat broke out along his hairline, tracking slowly down his temple. He looked at the silver rank insignia. He looked at the medals. The primitive lizard portion of his brain finally registered that he had spent his entire life bullying a predator. Marlene stood paralyzed beside him. The champagne flute in her hand tilted. Her fingers lost their grip. The delicate crystal hit the mahogany floor, shattering into countless glittering fragments. The pale, bubbling liquid splashed over the toes of her designer heels, soaking into the wood, but she did not blink. She stared at the uniform, her chest rising and falling in short, panicked, shallow gasps. The country club facade she wore like armor melted away, leaving only the raw, suffocating terror of a woman realizing her entire social empire was built on top of a federal landmine. The lawyers standing near the table shifted their weight, stepping back from Garrett as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. The insulation of his wealth evaporated. He was entirely exposed. The illusion of his rugged, self-reliant success crumbled under the sheer weight of actual hard-earned federal authority. Inside my uniform pocket, resting cold against my ribs, was my father's heavy brass stopwatch. The ticking mechanism felt like a second heartbeat. It was a grounding force, a reminder of the quiet, enduring honor that built the true foundation of the Lee family. Garrett had tried to overwrite that history with stolen cash and loud, hollow bragging. He had mistaken my silence for weakness, assuming my refusal to boast meant I possessed nothing worth showing. He was learning in real time that true power does not need to shout, it merely needs to arrive. The silence stretching across the municipal hall was no longer just a pause in conversation. It became a heavy physical entity. The wealthy guests who had spent the morning exchanging business cards and sipping expensive alcohol were now trapped in a vacuum. Nobody dared to cough. Nobody shifted their weight. They were witnessing the systematic public dismantling of a man they had admired just minutes prior. The golden child of the Boise Hills was being reduced to an ash heap by the sister he had openly mocked and discarded. I did not offer a greeting. I did not raise my voice to match the grand scale of the room. I reached under my left arm and produced the thick brown Department of Defense envelope. The gold foil eagle seal stamped on the upper corner caught the light, a quiet symbol of undeniable federal jurisdiction. I raised the heavy package a few inches above the oak table and let it drop. Thwack! The dense stack of classified medical records hit the wood like a fired gunshot. The sound made Garrett flinch his broad shoulders, jerking inward, as if shielding himself from a physical blow. His eyes darted from the brown envelope to my face. The smug, untouchable arrogance he had paraded around the barn last night was entirely gone. He was drowning in his own making, suffocating on the sudden realization that the dead soldier he used to fund his lavish lifestyle was not a forgotten name, lost in a bureaucratic filing cabinet. I looked directly into his dilated, terrified pupils. I stripped away all familial warmth, leaving only the clinical, unyielding detachment of a medical examiner determining a cause of death. I delivered the words he thought he had buried in the dirt. "Every fallen soldier crosses my table," I said, letting each syllable land with the crushing weight of a sledgehammer. I stepped 1 inch closer, forcing him to meet my stare, ensuring he felt the full, devastating impact of his own ignorance. "I signed that autopsy myself. Want to know what I found?" The fallout was instantaneous. In the corporate world, loyalty extends only as far as the profit margin. The moment I dropped that Department of Defense envelope onto the oak table, the invisible tether connecting Garrett to the Boise elite severed. The real estate partners, the banking executives, the county commissioner, they all shared a sharp, synchronized instinct for self-preservation. They looked at the classified seal, then at my silver oak leaves, and processed the terminal reality of the situation. Federal fraud. Stolen military life insurance. They stepped backward. The synchronized shuffling of expensive leather shoes scraping against the mahogany floorboards echoed through the grand hall. The crowd actively retreated, expanding the physical space around the signing table. Garrett became radioactive. Within 10 seconds, he stood stranded on an isolated island of his own, making surrounded by a ring of silent, judging eyes. Garrett's structural integrity failed. The rigid, arrogant posture of the self-made frontier patriarch dissolved. His knees buckled, lacking the strength to support his frame. He slammed his palms flat against the edge of the table to keep from collapsing onto the floor. His knuckles turned bone white under the strain. He opened his mouth, gasping for air, but his chest barely moved. He resembled a fish suffocating on dry pavement. He stared at the brown envelope. He knew he could not bribe his way out of a military autopsy. He knew he could not charm a federal medical examiner who had personally extracted the evidence from the victim's bones. The realization of a lengthy federal prison sentence crashed down on his shoulders, crushing the breath from his lungs. Narcissists do not possess the capacity for honorable surrender. When cornered, they search for a human shield. Garrett turned his head. His bloodshot eyes locked onto his wife. "It was her," Garrett croaked. His voice was a thin, raspy wheeze, stripped of all its former booming confidence. He raised a trembling hand, pointing his index finger directly at Marlene's face. "I just signed the papers. She found the private doctor. She coordinated the death certificate. She pushed the claim through the insurance board." He offered his own wife to the wolves without a single heartbeat of hesitation. He was willing to trade the mother of his children for a reduced sentence. Marlene flinched as if he had struck her across the jaw. The delicate cashmere shawl slipped from her shoulders, pooling on the floor next to the shattered remains of her champagne flute. The wealthy society woman, who had spent her morning bragging about her new fortune, was replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. "Ah, Garrett," Marlene gasped, her voice trembling. "How could you say that we did this together? You told me it was foolproof." "Shut up," Garrett hissed, his face twisting into a mask of ugly, desperate survival. "You ruined us." The betrayal broke her. Marlene's country club facade crumbled into raw, pathetic panic. Thick tears spilled over her lower eyelids, dragging dark streaks of expensive mascara down her pale cheeks. She let out a shrill, guttural sob that bounced off the high-vaulted ceilings of the municipal building. It was an ugly noise, the sound of sheer, unvarnished humiliation. She spun away from her husband. She looked at the crowd, searching the faces of the local elites for a shred of sympathy. They offered her nothing but cold, silent contempt. She had nowhere else to turn. She turned to me, the woman who had flicked a dirty napkin at my chest yesterday, the woman who had mocked my military career to her neighbors, suddenly decided we were kin. "Victoria," Marlene cried out, taking a frantic step forward. "Please, you cannot do this. We are your family. We are your blood." She lunged across the open space. I did not raise my hands. I did not shift into a defensive stance. I stood perfectly still, maintaining the rigid discipline of an officer on duty. Marlene crashed into my personal space, her hands reaching out in blind desperation. Her fingers adorned with heavy diamond rings, purchased with my stolen hazard pay, clamped down hard onto the lapel of my service dress blue uniform. Her acrylic nails dug into the midnight blue wool, gripping the fabric like a drowning sailor clinging to a lifeline. "Think about the ranch," Marlene begged, her breath hitching, sending the sour stench of stale champagne and fear sweat directly into my face. "Think about your father's legacy. If this gets out, we lose everything. They will take the land. Please just take the envelope back. Let us fix it quietly. For the family." I looked down at her hands gripping my uniform. I did not feel a spark of anger. I did not feel a trace of sorrow. I felt a profound, clinical emptiness. I took one slow, deliberate step backward. The movement was smooth, but carried the undeniable force of a trained soldier. The sudden shift in distance physically ripped the wool fabric straight out of her desperate grasp. Marlene stumbled forward, her hands grasping at empty air, her balance faltering. I raised my right hand and closed in a crisp white cotton glove. I looked directly into her weeping, panicked eyes. Slowly, methodically, I brushed the exact spot on my lapel where her fingers had touched the wool. I swept the invisible dirt away, cleansing the uniform of her contact. The gesture was microscopic, yet it carried infinite lethal disdain. "I only work for the dead," I stated. My voice was a flat, sterile void echoing across the quiet hall. The living answer to the law. Marlene let out a choked whimper, covering her mouth with both hands as the reality of my words sealed her fate. She shrank back, retreating toward the edge of the oak table, unable to maintain eye contact. Garrett, however, refused to accept his demise. He pushed himself off the edge of the table, staggering forward. His charcoal suit was rumpled, his tie skewed. "You ungrateful traitor!" Garrett spat, his tone fluctuating wildly between rage and despair. "I kept a roof over our heads. I kept Dad's ranch running while you were off playing in the mud. You owe me." "You did not keep the ranch running, Garrett," I replied, cutting through his delusion with surgical precision. "You failed. The bank was prepared to chain the gates 3 years ago." He stopped, his brow furrowed in confusion. "The mortgage payments." I continued, ensuring my voice reached the surrounding investors. "The equipment repairs, the property taxes. I paid them. Every single month, I wired my combat hazard pay into the agricultural lender's account to cover your perpetual deficits. You built your rugged frontier image using my blood money." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The local contractors, the men who had praised his business acumen, exchanged dark, knowing glances. The myth of Garrett Lee was officially pulverized. "No," Garrett whispered, shaking his head, his eyes darting frantically. "No, that is a lie." I stood in windowless rooms dissecting the brutalized remains of American heroes to keep you from going bankrupt, I said, stepping into his space, forcing him to look at the silver oak leaves on my shoulders. "And you repaid that sacrifice by desecrating the final benefit of a fallen soldier." I did not raise my voice. The cold, unyielding iron in my tone was enough to paralyze him. I delivered the final terminal sentence. "Your access to my life is permanently revoked." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The execution was complete. Garrett's jaw trembled. He looked around the grand hall, searching for a single friendly face, a single ally willing to step forward and intervene. He found nothing but a wall of silent judging statues. The empire he built on lies, forged signatures, and stolen valor had burned to the foundation. He was a king standing in a kingdom of ash. Through the tall arched windows of the municipal building, the morning sunlight fractured. A rhythmic, piercing strobe of red and blue light cut through the thin coastal fog rolling off the Boise foothills. The flashing beams painted the polished mahogany walls in harsh, alternating colors, slicing across the terrified faces of the local elite. The distant wail of sirens died out, replaced by the heavy, synchronized screech of thick rubber tires halting abruptly on the pavement outside. 3 matte black Chevrolet Suburbans, bearing federal government plates, idled directly in front of the grand entrance. The heavy reinforced doors swung open in unison. Special agents wearing dark, weather-resistant windbreakers stamped with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the Army Criminal Investigation Division stepped onto the concrete. Their tactical boots struck the stone steps with a unified, echoing precision. They breached the hall. They did not shout. They did not brandish weapons. They operated with a clinical, unyielding protocol that drained the remaining oxygen from the room. The lead CID investigator, a tall man with a rigid jawline and a clipped haircut, bypassed the catered espresso tables and the trembling real estate partners. He walked straight toward the oak conference table. He did not look at the expensive flower arrangements or the shattered crystal on the floor. He locked his eyes onto his target. Garrett Lee, the investigator, stated, his voice a flat, bureaucratic instrument of ruin. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and the fraudulent acquisition of service members' group life insurance funds. Place your hands behind your back." Garrett did not run. His legs lacked the structural integrity to carry him. A federal agent stepped behind him, grabbing his wrists with practiced, inescapable force. He pulled Garrett's arms backward, ruining the tailored line of his charcoal suit. Click, clack. The sharp mechanical bite of cold steel ratcheting over his wrists echoed through the cavernous chamber. It was a definitive, inescapable sound, the final punctuation mark on a ledger of lies. Marlene pressed her back against a marble pillar, her breathing shallow and erratic. She wrapped her arms around her own ribs, trying to shrink into the architecture. A female FBI agent intercepted her, presenting a secondary arrest warrant. "Marlene Lee, you are being detained as a co-conspirator in the laundering of federal funds," the agent announced, reaching for her trembling wrists. Marlene did not fight. She surrendered her hands, weeping silently as a mirrored set of iron cuffs locked her in place. The heavy cashmere shawl she had worn like a crown slipped from her shoulders, pooling on the dusty floorboards. The turquoise jewelry on her neck caught the blue and red strobe lights from the window, looking suddenly cheap and garish against the reality of federal custody. An evidence technician stepped up to the oak table, picking up the gold fountain pen Garrett had dropped. The technician slipped the pen along with the unsigned ranch expansion deeds into a clear plastic evidentiary bag. The seizure of assets had officially begun. The bank accounts, the sprawling cedar decks, the pristine pastures, all of it was already frozen in the digital ether. I turned my head away from the arrest, shifting my focus to the gallery of relatives and business partners. The contrast was a brutal, beautiful symmetry. Just 2 nights ago, I sat in the darkest corner of the backyard patio, staring down at a flimsy paper plate soaking in salmon grease. I had watched my uncle raise his glass to Garrett, nodding with profound respect at the man who had supposedly saved the family legacy. I had watched Aunt Brenda clap her hands, celebrating the genius of a brother who treated me like a morbid outcast. They had exiled me to the shadows, treating my military career as a shameful secret while they feasted on the spoils of my silent labor. Now the hierarchy was permanently rewritten. My uncle stood near the catering cart, his shoulders hunched, staring intently at the laces of his own leather shoes. He dared not lift his chin. Aunt Brenda held her breath, pressing herself against the far wall, terrified that making eye contact with me might somehow implicate her in the fallout. The people who had giggled at my threadbare coat and mocked my government paycheck were now trapped in a cage of their own making. They bowed their heads, stripped of their arrogant swagger, refusing to breathe too loudly in the presence of actual, untainted authority. They realized the quiet woman they banished to the edge of the patio was the only person in the room who truly owned the ground she stood on. The federal agents marched Garrett and Marlene toward the double oak doors. Garrett dragged his feet, his head hanging low between his shoulders, executing a slow, agonizing perp walk in front of the very community he had tried to buy. He did not look at me as he passed. His toxic pride was pulverized, reduced to a fine powder beneath the treads of my combat boots. I did not stay to watch the taillights fade. I had no interest in lingering inside a monument to false prestige. I turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd of panicked investors parted, granting me a wide, unobstructed path. But the older men, the local veterans wearing faded caps who had stood at attention when I entered, did not shrink away. They remained standing. They formed a loose, silent corridor leading to the doors. As I passed, they offered slow, respectful nods. They did not ask for the details of the arrest. They saw the silver oak leaves on my uniform. They saw the unyielding posture. And they understood the unspoken code. Honor had simply arrived to take out the trash. I pushed through the heavy brass handles of the municipal building and stepped out onto the concrete landing. The stale, suffocating scent of expensive cologne and fear vanished instantly. The wind sweeping down from the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains rushed over the plaza. It was biting sharp and pristine. It carried the crisp aroma of high-altitude snow, damp earth, and pine needles. I closed my eyes, letting the freezing current wash over my face. The lingering phantom smells of the Dover Port Mortuary, the sharp bleach, the isopropyl alcohol, the scorched Kevlar dissipated, carried away by the rushing mountain draft. My lungs expanded, pulling in a deep, unobstructed breath of clean Idaho air. The agonizing knot of isolation that had rested in the center of my chest for years, uncoiled and dissolved. I slid my right hand into the deep pocket of my uniform trousers. My fingertips brushed against the cold, dense brass of the antique stopwatch. I traced the tiny, jagged crack near the edge of the glass face. In the shadow of my pocket, the phosphorus dials glowed a steady, faint green. It was the pulse of a legacy untainted by greed. Chief Master Sergeant Walter Lee had spent his life believing that integrity was not a negotiable currency. He taught me that the fallen entrust their final truths to the hands of the living. The dead can't speak, so someone has to refuse to look away. I gripped the heavy brass casing. I did not look away. I had stood in the freezing, windowless laboratories and documented the sacrifices of heroes, and today I had stood in a grand hall and defended their memory against a parasite. I had preserved the sanctity of the table where they lay. The promise was kept. I released the watch, pulling my hand back into the brisk morning air. I walked down the steps toward my rental car, the leather soles of my shoes clicking a steady, even rhythm against the pavement. I left the wreckage of the Lee family ranch behind me, untethered from their toxic expectations and their fragile, empty empires. True freedom is never found by shrinking into the shadows to appease the arrogant. It is forged by standing directly in the light and letting the truth incinerate the lies. If you found satisfaction in watching stolen valor face the ultimate federal reality, hit the like button and subscribe to Violet Slow Vengeance. Drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts on this story. Until next time, stay vigilant and never let anyone silence your truth.